energy disruptors. Please welcome to the stage, Alix Steele.
We're going to get some chairs set up. It's great to have everybody here. So my day job, I work in radio and TV for Bloomberg, headquartered in New York, but I've also spent a long time, like almost 20 years, covering energy and commodities, and energy transition is one of the most fascinating topics of our time, and I love talking about it. I love talking about it every day. So I'm super excited for this panel because this is all the stuff we need to do to get it done. And for that, please help me welcome Tracey Sletto, CEO, Canada Energy Regulator. Then Dan Gardner, I'm sure you all heard him speak before, award-winning journalist and best-selling author of risk management, forecasting, and big products. And then Heather Chalmers, president and CEO of GE Vernova. And then Shana Martineau is CEO of AIOC. So this is great. I feel like we have regulators. Dan, I'll call you like an expert. Yeah? A commentator, big picture guy.
Writer.
Okay, he's that guy. And then we have industry, and then we have community. So I feel like it's a really good bucket of how we're going to address all these big issues. So I asked the panel to start off by giving me one word on how they think you can get something done. I don't know, is it an idea? Is it money? Is it talking to people? Have you done your assignment, you guys? Mm-hmm. Yes, okay, Tracey, go first.
My one-word answer is culture, actually. And to focus on culture in not only the way the system works and from a regulatory perspective, how our regulator works, but I think how we're making decisions and how we're approaching those decisions.
Culture, all right, Dan, what you got?
Experience. Human beings are really bad at figuring out problems and coming up with solutions that work right the first time. So we need to try ideas, work them out, as we heard in the opening comments, in fact, and that's experience. Experience is what matters.
And that goes back to kind of what you were saying in your speech about like innovation's great, but maybe not the thing you want to do all the time. All right, what about you, Heather?
My one word is partnership. Partnership in terms of the stakeholders to get to a financial investment decision, and then partnership in very different ways in order to execute on the project in a world right now that's anything but steady state, and it's all about dealing with challenges.
Shana?
And I'm going to say relationships, so maybe not so different from partnerships, but I really think relationships are the way that you motivate people to come on board to solve your big problem. They are the way that you can move things through government and regulations. They are about finding partners. And so I think that all starts when you have really good, solid relationships built on trust, and then you can move mountains.
That's so interesting. Like, no one mentioned money or like ideas or rules. I thought for sure rules was going to be up there. That's quite interesting. You all are talking about the same kind of idea. How good do you think we're doing in all of these things? What do you think, Tracey?
Well, I think, and it's interesting, I was waiting for you when you talked about rules. I assumed you were looking at the regulator.
No.
Not an unfair
we love rules.
question.
I'm from the US.
I love rules.
You do.
There you go.
Yes.
When we talk about how things are moving, I think it's fair and important for us to recognize that the context in which we're making these decisions has changed, of course, and there are complexities that are present and have been for years. But I do see a lot of progress, and I do see a shift in how those decisions are being made. I see evidence, even in conversations such as this. I'm watching students from grade 9 classrooms right through to CEOs of major investment companies deciding on how they're going to make those decisions. And so I do see progress being made, and specifically in how those decisions are being made. So the partnerships that are happening both in Indigenous equity ownership interests in projects, really important. How we're including Indigenous peoples in our regulatory oversight is changing. And when that shifts, then we are going to be able to unlock, I think, the ability to be able to move ahead on complex issues and challenges and projects.
Shana, what do you think?
I would totally agree. I think, we've seen some really exciting things. When we think about just a little over 2 years ago, AIOC was a really fledgling organization, and we didn't have a big track record behind us. We'd done a couple of, smaller projects that kind of got people thinking of the art of the possible. And then the project that we announced with Enbridge really sort of opened people's minds up to, wow, there are some big things that can get done. And through relationships and partnerships, it's really a new way of coming at it. And I've been so thrilled with the response since that time, with leaders from all over, cross industry, from community, from government, wanting to do more and think bigger. And so I think it's a really exciting time. In a way, we were kind of deadlocked there for a while, right? And I feel like
For
we're
the
starting
US,
to come.
we understand.
Yeah.
For the US, we know how that feels. Heather, but okay, so you're in industry. How does a project start for you? Like, do you call up the regulators and say, like, what can I do? Or do you have an idea and then you try and like talk to the different communities and the different people? Like, how does that work from an industry perspective?
It depends, my answer is depends, and it depends on the type of project. One of the ones we're working on, like maybe I'll give you a first of a kind example and then more of a more run-of-the-mill. But we're working with Ontario Power Generation on the Western world's first small modular nuclear reactor. And in order to make that come to light, there's a lot of things that need to fall into place. Certainly there has to be confidence that we have the technology as the first of a kind, that it is more than just a PowerPoint exercise, and we've got a path forward in order to do that. And then you get into the funding, and then you get into the regulatory, and then the project execution side. So there's a tremendous amount that has to come into place. And I would say in this particular opportunity, two things I think that are unique that have helped that. One is we've got what's called a common design. So you've got 4 different partners that are together contractually to build this small modular reactor. And I'm going to use your term, to get your Lego on. So building a common design so that you can rinse and repeat these small modular reactors all over the world. And then the other unique thing is on the delivery side, we've got an integrated delivery framework where everybody's incented, all the partners involved are incented for an outcome. And it's through a shared risk-reward model to incent that problem solving, because you know that there are going to be challenges with a first of a kind. And I think on the run-of-the-mill stuff, it's very different. You would have to go through more traditional regulatory hurdles, financing hurdles. But the problem solving at the point of work is still very germane.
Interesting. Dan, do you think that we're doing a good job at sort of talking to each other about these projects and about these issues and getting them done? Or do you think we still get stuck in things like innovation or rules? No offense.
Yeah, I would say it's a question of your perspective. Is the glass half full or glass half empty? I completely agree with all the comments, in particular SMRs, the fact that SMRs are now, we have finally, after 60 years, figured out that in fact small modular reactors are a better idea for nuclear power than building grandiose machines. That is in fact progress. And we see a lot of progress. But on the other hand, this is the glass half empty portion.
You're like an economist, yeah.
You take a look at the database of big project outcomes, and it's pretty grisly. It's pretty bad. And when we look at why projects fail, it's not for the reasons that people often think. It's not because of the engineering, it's not because of the science and technology. It's usually because of, we break it down into 3 categories: politics, culture, and psychology. They are fundamentals, and we know the solutions to those fundamentals. We know what we should be doing, but too often, even today, even in very straightforward projects, we don't do those things, and we get into trouble as a result.
But why? Why don't we do them?
Because they're fundamental drivers. They're all pushing in one direction. So both, by politics, by the way, I don't mean necessarily partisan politics. I'm just talking about money. Who gets what, right? So there's that. There's culture, and by culture, I mean the culture of business. And the culture of business is to get stuff done. We got to get stuff done. And planning isn't, we got to dig a hole and see the hole getting bigger. That's progress. And by psychology, I mean, of course, I'm sure you've all read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That's what I mean. And if you haven't read it, by the way, that's the book you should be reading. If you look at each of those 3 elements, they all push in the same direction. They all push us towards a premature start. They all push us away from careful, comprehensive planning of the sort that we should be doing, not as a bureaucratic process, but as an experiential learning process. And they push us towards just get going, just start digging. And those are really fundamental drivers. And it is actually very difficult to overcome those. And you need to be sophisticated about it. You need to know that those are the root causes, and you need to have a determined plan in order to overcome them. But we can. There are plenty of examples where we have done that.
So it's think slow, act fast?
That's ideal. We should be thinking slow, careful planning, and therefore that will facilitate us to act fast.
Okay. To Heather, to industry, is that hard or easy to do, to think slow and act fast?
I think
the pause says it all.
Yeah,
I don't know.
no. But yeah, we talked a little bit about this. In fact, I thought I was going to be lying on a couch and needed to have therapy.
So they had a prep call together with me. Everyone else was separate, and they just went off for like 30 minutes on like the philosophy and the theory of projects. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have it. In addition to being the president and CEO of GE Vernova Canada, where we have a number of technologies in our portfolio, I also lead our hydro business for North America, where we're working on a ton of refurbishment projects. So that allows me a view right where the work is getting done, and the devil's in the details. And I do think there's a lot of effort that goes into planning a project, but despite the best of intention, stuff happens. And we spend a lot of time hiring people with the right technical skills, whether it's engineering, project directors, construction and commissioning, all with the, as I said, the technical skills, but we don't necessarily help them or develop them or support them in terms of that problem solving.
Yes.
Right where the work is getting done so that you can act fast. Sometimes being wrong or maybe taking a hit in a project in order to move it forward is the best thing for the overall health and wellness of that project. And so that culture piece is so important, and I think that is going to be a big part of what we need to think about as leaders to scale and pace the energy infrastructure that has to happen. Huge projects, to the likes that we've never seen before, and we don't have enough people to do the work.
Right, but that's the problem, right? Because then you can act slow and think slow from that. Like, it's different if you're refurbishing something, right? But if you're actually like, it's a shovel project where no one's done it before, that's a whole different scenario.
But refurbishment, like in this case, hydro, you really don't know what you've got until you lift that lid, and it's 60 years since that's happened. So how do there's a lot of discussion around standard work and lean and whatnot. And that's definitely with a process and whatnot, but how do you take taking that standard process to problem solving at the point of work, to the people closest to the work?
So Shayna, this goes to then how you guys look at projects. So you have a very specific vetting process on what kind of projects you would back, et cetera. Do you guys think slow and act fast? Do you feel like you are slow on both? Do you it's hard. Or do you think fast and act slow? What do you think?
I think it depends who on my team you're talking to. My team might say I think fast and maybe act fast sometimes, but I'm the charge ahead. And so what I was thinking about when you were all talking was a little bit about making sure that for us anyway, what's key is tone from the top and that leadership, and to keep the team driving forward, despite failures, despite obstacles, giving them permission to fail, but also supporting, the support that you talked about, but also keeping them inspired and focused on moving things forward. And so for us, we are also charting on, uncharted territory with these projects, and it's a multiple complex stakeholder environment involving all of these disciplines. And what I would say is having each one of those stakeholders aligned to the outcomes, financial incentives if possible, but even then you need more than that. You need that sort of intrinsic determination that we are going to come together and solve this problem because it's different than what we faced before. And everyone's got to come in with that mindset. There's a bit of creativity and perseverance that we actually need to see from all parties to bring this to fruition.
So is there like a feeling there that it's okay if one project isn't great? Like, you'd rather move ahead to be able to show what you can do? Or are you sort of going to be super strict on your guidelines?
I think it depends on how aligned you are at the beginning. So the other piece that I talk about a little bit, especially with the Indigenous partnerships, is have the hard conversations early. Don't save them till later. So if you're still working on foundational trust issues and legacy issues 3 or 6 months in, it's too late. Like when you get really through the tough parts of the projects, if you can get through that, have the tough conversations really early. It might slow you down, but it is, go slow to go fast.
But then after that, you can act fast. So Tracey, from my world of U.S. policy, regulation is slow as molasses, and like it's way behind the times, and they cannot keep up, and then they just make regulations to put it out there, and it slows everything down. I assume that's not what you're trying to do, because on our prep call, it seems like you want to think and act fast.
That's right.
How do you do it? How's it going?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting conversation. I've been a public servant my whole life, and when I came to the regulator, I learned that the role of a regulator is quite unique in the context of the public service. And there, of course, the first thing that comes to mind often when you talk about the regulator are rules. But why do we have rules? Like, why is anything regulated? And in the context of energy, it's regulated because for a few reasons. There's lots of risks associated with these activities. There's risks associated with safety. There's risks associated with economic monopolistic power. There's risks associated with impacts to Indigenous rights and interests in these projects. And so there's rules and regulations that are really meant to help both transparently and ideally effectively and efficiently set the game rules for companies to operate in a way that helps to manage and mitigate those risks. And so as a regulator, of course, we want our regulatory frameworks to be responsive. We want them to be streamlined. We want them to be targeted and effective. We're not interested in, no one's getting a bonus by adding more rules, right? What we want is regulation that's responsive. And particularly for the Canada Energy Regulator, we're thinking about how we regulate in an environment where those risks are changing because the economic and energy mix is changing. And we very quickly. And we want to be in a place where we're able to ensure that we have the expertise to be able to work with partners and with regulated entities and with Indigenous communities and nations to be able to have those conversations. And I really want to pick up on the themes that we're talking about here around trust and culture. Because I think to a large extent what you're seeing in our regulatory focus is a shift to that early engagement, those early identifications of issues. Clear ground rules, clear articulation of what would be expected in regulatory processes.
So do you go to them, they come to you, and you guys sort of just hash it out in the beginning?
It's both, and it's not just with industry. So we'll work with industry and proponents, but we'll also work with those communities and be able to be there to say, what's on your mind in the context of this project? How might those issues and impacts be identified early so that at the, those are much more easily handled at the beginning stage of a project, to your point, to be able to think slow and act fast. So that early engagement process in a meaningful way, and I'll say this in two parts. One is to not only have engagement in the projects themselves with proponents and with companies, but to have meaningful engagement in the regulatory oversight of those projects. It's 2 tracks, and I think to make sure that...
like you check in with them as it goes and be like, hey, how's it going? What are you thinking? Et cetera, et cetera.
More than that, we would have, for example, with Indigenous communities, we would have inspectors and monitors working side by side to enforce those compliance rules. And so that there's increasing trust in not only the projects themselves, but the oversight of those projects to make sure those risks are managed safely. So that's a big focus for us.
This is a really dumb question, but that sounds really smart. Is that unusual? This setup? Is this a new way of looking at regulation?
Well, I can say for us, it's relatively new because it's been years in the making, but it's relatively new. But it is a shift in our paradigm of not only what a regulator's role is and how we conduct our work. Again, that's why when you ask what's the word, it's culture. But it's also thinking about safety in a more holistic way. There were decades where we described safety as in a fairly narrow and limited way, and it's important to do that, right? Safety in the context of making sure product stays in the pipe or electricity stays without charge, all those sorts of things, right?
Those are good things.
But we're now thinking about safety in that more holistic way because it's key to building trust. So thinking about cultural safety, thinking about impacts to Indigenous communities and interests. So it's a paradigm shift holistically for us.
Shannon, you've been nodding and smiling a lot as Tracey's been talking.
I'm like, Tracey and I feel like we should be talking weekly. Do
Do you guys not? Like you should be, right?
Yeah, no, you know what? We're actually, my organization isn't. The communities are, I think, speaking to you regularly.
They are.
But my organization, we don't get involved in the regulatory aspects typically. So we're all on the finance enabling side. And so we deal a lot with the investment bankers and the lawyers.
I gotcha. Heather, do you talk to Tracey? Do you guys know each other?
Not directly.
No.
I'm just. But I liked your comment about just building trust and the knowledge sharing. And I will say that whether it's the federal government, provincial government, or other different stakeholder groups, people are thirsty for knowledge, but they want to learn in a safe environment. And I would just share that, Kendall talked about it earlier with regards to carbon capture and sequestration and why it's a very good solution as we get to a net zero grid. Governments, regulatory bodies need to understand that technology is going to take time. And there's an evolution to it. So bringing them along, like even the evolution of the clean electricity regulation, it's very different today than what it was originally, what it originally looked like. And that's through a lot of education. The Federal Impact Assessment Agency, they've been incredibly open about listening to just the practical realities of things and projects. So I guess the lesson learned for me and for my team for a long time is don't hesitate to reach out and just offer some insight, because we're learning here at a pace that we've never done before.
So here's my other question. This kind of dovetails on what you're talking about is how do you share risk? Because at the end of the day, this is what we're all talking about. How do you de-risk a project, whether that's on a safety level, whether that's financially? And I know in the US, for example, like offshore wind got really hit because the operators and the builders took on all of the risk. And then that has now really shifted the industry back a bit, and they're really trying to make up for it now. And they're trying to understand how to restructure the risk for them. Dan, can you give me some insight into how a good risk sharing in a project works?
Well, let me start with how it should not be done, and then go to how it should be done. I'm from Ottawa. We have a light rapid transit system that we're all embarrassed by. And in large part...
You're embarrassed by it? Is that what you said?
Embarrassed by.
Why are you embarrassed by it?
Because it's a mess. It's been a mess throughout. It's still not operating properly.
We got the MTA, so I don't know.
If anybody's from Ottawa, you know what I'm talking about. It was a mess. The whole project was a mess. There are many problems. Anytime you do a postmortem, there are many problems. But one of the central problems was, from the very beginning, the city decided, as the client, how do we de-risk the project? Well, first of all, you don't de-risk a project. There's always risk. It's got to go somewhere. So what did they decide? They said, well, the consortium that's building this, it's all on you.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is terrific, because then it came along and they were digging, and then there was a sinkhole in central Ottawa. And then, oh, that's very expensive. That's the kind of surprise that's very expensive. But it's not on the city, so wasn't this a terrific idea? Well done for you for creating that contract. But guess what? When you create a contract in which you put all the risk on the construction companies, what happens? When problems arise, do people rally around and say, okay, everybody pull together, let's find solutions and work together? No, they don't. They call their lawyers, and they start pointing fingers, and the moment lawyers are involved, you're screwed. And so that's where it went south. So now let me flip this around and say, how do you do this properly? Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport. Heathrow Airport, everybody knows, is an enormous airport in London. Terminal 5 is an enormous terminal that was built in the middle of Heathrow Airport while Heathrow continued to operate. They could not stop the operation of Heathrow even for a minute to build this project, which is an amazing thing, right? Very successful. What was the key reason for success of that Terminal 5 project? Because the client said the risk is on us. And they gave contracts that said all the contractors and the subcontractors and all the principal contractors, they said the risk is on us. You're guaranteed cost plus. You're going to get your cost back, and if you meet performance benchmarks, you're going to get bonuses. But if things go south, you're not going to end up bankrupt. Well, you say, that's dangerous. How can you do that? Why would you do that? The answer is because it's more dangerous not to. And what happened? Because they created that contractual relationship, They had problems, big surprise. Every big project, there are always surprises, there are always problems. And when the problems happen, guess what? Everybody sat down and said, how are we gonna work together to find solutions? And they did, and it rolled along smoothly, and they opened on time.
Because the incentive structure was such
Because
that
the
like
incentives-
everybody had a stake in a pie in a certain way.
Exactly.
Interesting. Heather, what do you feel like is your need to de-risk, or like how do you think of something like that?
Well, I think you captured it. There's first of all, you have to look at the project and figure out who's best served, to mitigate particular parts of risk. But I do think contracts, two things. I would say contracts that have a shared risk reward model, and it can be through a cost plus, it can be through target pricing. There's different mechanisms, but again, you're focused on an outcome, and you're focused on the problem solving to get to that outcome as soon as possible, and giving people the tools to make the decision. That's one. The other is getting into longer term agreements as well, frame agreements, whatever you want to call them, where you're not bidding on projects one RFP at a time. When suppliers know that there's certainty of a volume for a period of time, that gives us a lot more confidence to invest in our supply needs, whether those are human resources, whether it's the supply chain that we rely on. And I don't think that we've done enough of that. And I come back to just the number of infrastructure projects that are going to happen in order to fulfill our electrification or decarbonization needs. That certainty of volume is going to be very meaningful because right now there isn't enough supply chain to do the work. So you've got the shared risk reward, and then you've got the longer term volume certainty to invest in supply chain.
Quick follow on that. The long term, so I'll just call them offtake agreements, whether or not that's what you mean, but let's just for common word.
There's different.
So for offtake agreements like that, how hard is it to come to that price? Because what I keep hearing from industry is that like, yeah, we can get you the supply, but the buyer won't pay what we then want them to pay. And like coming to that agreement on price is really, really hard because no one wants to bear more of the risk than the other. Are you experiencing the same issue?
That's why, like, without getting into a lot of the detail, but we tend to settle on a target price. And it builds on what you talked about, experience. So looking at past projects, what did we think we were going to do, and where did we practically end up, and being very honest with ourselves about why we got to where we did. It would be great if we said, hey, all projects were ahead of time and below cost, but that's just not necessarily a reality in the environment that we're in right now with inflation, human resource challenges, supply chain challenges. The geopolitical landscape is changing. So we typically go with a target price that is informed by past experience as much as we can. And then you've got a shared risk reward. So if we do better, you share in that. And if we do not as optimally, we share in that as well. So you're always incented to improve.
Sheena, what about from where you sit?
Well, I think those models work really well in our environment too. And so I think for too long, we talked about being stuck and having Indigenous relationships really be stuck with the regulator, for instance, right? So you're far better to have those tough conversations earlier, because I know that when you go to speak to the regulator, if you've got your Indigenous partners on side, then those conversations are a lot easier and better received. And then I would say the same, the shared risk reward model. So for too long, one of the reasons that we got stuck is that the Indigenous communities only shared in the risk side. So the projects were built on their lands, in their backyard, and I want you to just think about the nice cozy backyard that you have attached to your home, and think about an excavator pulling up there, and you're going to build a mine or a power plant. How do you feel about that? And how different is that conversation if you share in the economic rent and profit from those projects? And so it's the shared risk and reward model and the aligned stakeholder interests, I think, that gets big things done in that way and makes life easier with the regulator.
And how are those conversations evolving? Like, is that, when you speak to project managers, et cetera, like, are they much more interested in that? Are they happy to share that kind of risk? Are they open to that communication?
I think anything new is hard. Right? Like, I think anything new is hard.
Very
it takes
good diplomatic
creativity,
answer.
right? Well, no, but I mean, we've done 7 projects, so we've been in existence for 5 years. So that's not, we're not setting any land speed records there, but the ones we've done have been meaningful, and they've had the alignment of interests, they've had the shared risk reward model, and they've had leaders, I would say, that are open-minded to trying new things and going about things in a new way. Because an Indigenous way is not your typical corporate way. I always say this isn't letting your corp dev team and some lawyers get in a room and box, which might be, how things happen other times.
And Tracey, from your end, it does sound like how maybe you view your role is you are part of helping de-risk those things by talking. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I think that it's thinking about risk, like we've spoken right now around investment risk, we've talked about technological risk, but I think there's a public acceptability risk that's present in big projects that needs to be really thought through in a careful way. And that public acceptability, and particularly when the energy mix is changing and there's going to be real worries and real fears, like people will have questions. What does an SMR look like in my community?